Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rula Jones, and I am currently the gallery director at Blackrock Center for the Arts. And I am the curator also of this particular exhibition entitled Handcrafted, which features 23 artists and will run until April 15th. Joining me today to discuss the exhibition and various themes are Lisa Battle. She creates a distinctive style of abstract ceramic sculptures and serves on the board of the Washington Sculptures Group and is represented by Studio Gallery in Washington, D.C. and Wyndham Fine Arts in Wyndham, New York. Her work was recently selected for Breaking Through: The Rise of American Women Artists, an annual juried exhibition as part of an initiative to host 25 museum exhibitions for women artists over 25 years. Also joining us is Cece McInturf. She is a sculptor and is with the Otis Street Arts Projects and uses organic ephemera, plant, and animal materials in much of her art. Her current emphasis is on combining species not found in the same ecosystem to examine cooperation and possibility, and documenting her outdoor installations as the natural materials decompose back to the earth where they originated. Andrea Finch is a quilted textile artist whose work has left the surface to become sculptures. She works with all fabrics, from discarded decorator samples to traditional quilting fabrics. As a member of Studio Artists Quilt Association, and through her work on the board of the Virginia Quilt Museum, a local gallery and council for the arts in Pennsylvania, she creates opportunities for other artists to flourish also. Felisa Fetterman is an independent mixed media artist, and she has been co-leading a yarn bomb collaborative public project for the Wheaton Streets. During her last exhibition, she had an old-fashioned mannequin where the public could participate by actually adding fiber materials into it while learning about textile techniques. Sarah J. Hall recently completed her certificate and began her diploma studies in technical embroidery with the UK-based Royal School of Needlework. Her work was included in an exhibition at Rome Art Week this past fall, and she has a solo exhibition, Taxonomy of Evanescence, opening at the end of April in Washington, D.C. Sukyun Park is a member of the Washington Sculpture Group and currently serves as the vice president of HMAA and is an MFA candidate. Her work focuses on paper. We also have Margaret Kolkovich, and she exhibits regularly with Gallery 209, is on the board of artists on Market and the Art League of Germantown. She is currently finishing a certificate program in botanical illustration at Brookside Gardens. Also joining us is Alan Rosenbaum. He is a studio artist and former professor at the Virginia Commonwealth University. He has received individual artist fellowships from the Virginia Commission for the Arts in both craft and sculpture. He has been actively making and exhibiting art for more than 40 years. Kanika Sakar, she exhibits work at Waverly Street Gallery in Bethesda and through the region in national group shows. And her ceramics are abstract visions of environment, real or imagined, and their surfaces are brought into focus by images of texts and maps. We also have Patricia DePaul Wilberg, and she has exhibited her fine arts and influenced glassworks around the DMV area in her most recent honor of having her piece Stepping Off in our current exhibition, and was also reviewed in the Old Town Crier magazine. Erwin Timmers is the founder of the Washington Art School and has done numerous public art projects. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you. Okay. Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen our catalog, and this will give those of you who have not had a chance to come and see the exhibition to really look at the works that are on view. So I'm going to admit one more person, running a little bit late, but she is also an artist. Phyllis, she's coming in just a bit late. And just to go back, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you a little about her as well. So Phyllis Mays is a member of the NOMA Gallery in Frederick, Maryland. She paints, draws, does embroidery, and makes assemblages. And she makes no distinction between fine art and craft. Very good. Okay, so, and I think that that is really what is very interesting about this exhibition, because even though we've gone through modernism, where hierarchy of media has really been dissembled, there still is this sort of idea that there is a distinction between art and craft. And certainly I think for myself as a curator, as an artist, when I see proposals, I sometimes do, feel, oh, this is craft and this is fine art. And I can't tell what is that distinction? How do we make that distinction? And I mean, is it philosophy? Is it the fact that something is utilitarian, or so forth? So I'm going to go ahead and begin sharing the screen of the catalog, and whoever would like to jump in and answer that question, please go ahead and do so.
Well, I checked it out in Japan, where there is no separate word for either. And I checked it out. I'm sorry. And I checked it out in India, where there is no word for craft except the English word, which is then spelt in all the languages. So there you have two Asian cultures which don't have a word for craft. Therefore, I think it's Europeanization that has unfortunately reached the Western Hemisphere all too deeply.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so the language informs our concept about and informs our distinctions. It's very interesting. So when I actually began curating the exhibition, Handcrafted had been an annual exhibition by my predecessor, and it was only allowed to have turned wood and embroidery and quilts, any kind of fabric. And I just opened up the entire exhibition to include all media, because I was not quite sure what those two particular mediums had in common with each other, and why they were the only ones that were within an exhibition that was entitled Handcrafted, because clearly we all craft with our hands, and as artists, or most of us do. Jeff Koons doesn't. And how does that really relate to, new media, technology, and so forth? Are they crafting with their hands or not? And that's also quite sort of a contentious, it's controversial. People have different viewpoints, and it's all fine. That's my whole reasoning about doing Handcrafted. And for me, it really was about, is something, because it's made out of a certain material like ceramic, a craft, or because it has a use, and what makes it become into that level of fine art? And do we have any artists here who believe that there is a difference between craft and fine art, and understands that difference? No. Okay.
I'm going to jump in for a moment on that. I think a lot of it goes down to intent. I think during the opening reception, you and we chatted about the historical tradition of samplers. And when a sampler was initially made back in the 1800s, it was a portfolio of the development of a young girl's development in her hand stitching ability. And then she would take that portfolio along to her, she'd take her sample cloth along to various ateliers or different tailors just to say, this is what I can do. And, that's the idea of a sampler. Now you can buy a kit. And, if a kit is something that everyone is mass markedly reproducing, it's the question of, if you buy a coloring book of Van Gogh's, are you creating Van Gogh's? And so a lot of it goes down to the intent. And, a lot of us, speaking for myself, the materials that I choose, they're no different than paint. It's no different than using a pencil. It's just I choose to draw with line and my lines are drawn with thread instead of drawing them with pencil. So I think for me, it goes down to intent of how it's displayed and what goes into it.
Okay. I like that. So the intention is not really a material base because you're using silk, right? In a lot of your works, and they are. I was just wondering what influence you've had in terms of art historical, because just thinking your works are very minimalist. I would say. Do you have
I was trained as an architect.
Okay.
So I was trained with drafting lines of weights, line weights with pen and pencil.
Okay.
So there is understanding the quality of line, and you can do a micron 0.005 all the way to micron 8. And so you're changing the thickness, so you're changing the level that it's seen. So when I look at one of my pieces, I'm actually seeing something very sculptural. And with the thread, you just have this extra textural element that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were using a pencil line. So for me, the material is an extended way to begin to explore some of the concepts in a more sculptural way, tactile way, to explore some of the concepts that I would do if I was drawing. And it's just become more responsive over time as sort of I've let go of some of the stringent, strict guidelines of I am building a building, I am drafting a building, I'm drafting a bathroom, which, that's what all level 1 architects do. So, it's getting that, starting to play with other factors as well, and understanding that light, because it is a dimensional material, light plays an integral role in the creation of these materials. And that's one of the reasons why I also tend to use very minimal color, because the light is such an important part of the piece itself.
Excellent. Yes. So, so light influences the work, and we all know that, right, as artists, and that's such an important element. And I love how you were saying that, I have to keep the color sort of minimal so that we can emphasize the light. I think a lot of sculptors often also feel that they need to limit the color in order to emphasize the shape. Is that true for any of the sculptors we have here, or 3D artists, or sorry, it's definitely 3D, Sarah. But anybody else?
Well, on the contrary, I think I make non-functional, hence not utilitarian pots, and so does Lisa Battle.
Yeah.
But they're sculptural enough, but I tend to focus on surface as well as form. But I trained as a painter. I trained as an anthropologist, but I also trained with etching and painting. And when I began to move towards ceramics, because of changes of where I lived and so on and so forth, a painter friend of mine told me not to worry, because I was worried, because I did have that art craft distinction in my head. There's no craft. There's no craft label put on etching, which is highly, highly technical, and so is painting. But he said it's just another substrate, and that set me free. So I do whatever I please, and I'm unfortunately beset by people who said, "But what is it for?" And I say, "It's for your head, for all I can, because I can." That's it. There you go. Did I say I was trained as an anthropologist? That's very important to me, because I do think that meaning and how you perceive anything is moment by moment in your eye. Therefore, there's no, these words are very important, and hence I use them all the time, as you can see.
Yes, an anthropologist background is very important. I think that can you talk a little bit more about how that influences your work? Because I know you use maps.
Well, I was at Smith where I met Leonard Baskin, and he taught me how to do etchings and set myself free from whatever it was that my actual major was imposing upon me. And then I went to the University of Chicago, which set me even freer by saying that, at least in the anthropology department, culture is a matter of meanings and symbols, and these change, momentarily from time to time. Therefore, one of my great influences were these French deconstructionists.
Mm.
You know, they've sat in my head despite whatever I might say about Europeanization and so on. And I use them a lot to see the momentariness, the fleeting, you know, meaningfulness of anything. It's how we frame it in language. And, you know, language changes from moment to moment.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Excuse me, if we compare our language now, the English language in particular, you know, it's interesting with all the technology, it's changed dramatically. This is a beautiful piece, Glacial Melt. Is that a work that addresses climate change?
Yes, I did a show on climate change, and this wasn't in the show because I forgot. But yes, it's about climate change, and that's at the back of my mind, despite whatever else is in the front of my mind.
Yeah, I would have to agree that this is a very dominant theme that I see a lot in art, because clearly we are all concerned about climate change. And we have a lot of other artists here and who are thinking about that in particular. And so actually, I can't see all of you. Erwin Timmers, let's go to your work. And sorry, I have to go back and forth in this catalog to find your pieces.
Okay.
But maybe you can talk a little bit about, there we go. So we have this piece in particular, Contain, Sustain, and you use recycled glass, is that?
Yes. Yeah. So for me, sort of like recycling comes through in both the contents as well as in the materials that I use. And sometimes the focus on materials puts it sort of back into craft a little bit, if we're talking about art versus craft, right?
Right, yeah.
So, you know, I feel like art focuses mostly on the content, on the story, on the message, versus craft material is much more important. So I sort of straddle the both of them, I feel. But yeah, I feel like bringing a message across by the materials that I use becomes much more potent. So in this case, I've used recycled glass to remake these plastic water bottles that are sort of my pet peeve of, you know, what the environment is having to absorb all these little bottles. So here the bottles are made out of glass in the exact same shape as the plastic waters would be. And trying to maybe even get like an educational message across, not necessarily some sort of art concept of, you know, what are we doing? What's, you know, what's going on here? Right. So all of my pieces pretty much contain some recycled glass. I can't say 100%, but definitely a lot. And they're all pretty much all focus on that whole concept of what are we doing with the earth? Where are we going? Sort of asking questions about our society, about the use of the reserves and the resources that we have, and that we're using it up pretty much.
Right. So is glass a more sustainable material than plastic?
Well, it is. It's odd. It's sort of, as far as the recycling technology goes, there's been a bit of a change. It used to be sort of like the most recyclable product. And now the general industry is saying, no, glass is not the answer. It's mostly because it's very heavy and fragile. Heavy to transport from whatever source of recycling to processing facilities. And then also heavy in transporting the goods that come packaged in glass. So I hear from a lot of sources that they would rather see more recyclable plastics and or aluminum. So there's even a couple of counties around us, I know in Virginia, that have stopped collecting glass altogether. And whatever glass they accidentally get, they will recycle into either like reflective, what do you call that? Little pieces of reflective glass that go into road paint, so to make the road paint more reflective, or into fiberglass, but it does not go back into making new bottles or windows. And that's also for me, it's so like there's so much of that material around, right? That nothing happens to. Like windows will never get recycled. Nobody recycles windows. The Safeway, the Safeway project that I mentioned initially, Safeway grocery stores traditionally have huge glass storefronts. And when we were doing the Safeway, and they were specifically interested in using recycled materials in their new artwork, because it is a LEED, it was like the first LEED certified Safeway store in the area. So they loved that concept. And I tried to talk to the contractor about removing some of that huge glasswork that's in the front. He said, well, we don't have a way to do that. It just all gets smashed to pieces and it all gets hauled away. So we ended up taking out windows from the interior of the store, but we couldn't really touch the glasswork from the outside of the store because it was just, there was no method of separating it out from the rest of the trash.
Interesting.
So I find that sort of telling on how, you know, we have all these resources that we're just not using because they are cheaper and or more convenient ways of getting new product. Whereas sort of in the long run, I feel like we need to come up with ways to utilize what we already have instead of, you know, keep on using new resources.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Sukyun, I want to talk about your pieces in particular because this, I don't know if your intention for these works were to talk about the ocean, but certainly paper has, I don't know how you know, environmentally friendly paper has, but I know that it does have quite a long tradition in Asia and has been used for, you know, centuries, right? And that I think that there has always been a sort of sense, particularly in Asia, a very profound sense that nature is all-encompassing and that we as human beings are a part of it. And certainly that the artwork that we create does not necessarily have to be, you know, last very long. And therefore paper is a perfectly fine material to use. And so I used in doorways and so forth. There's this sense of like, everything is passing and, you know, nothing is infinite. Just thinking back and about, you know, just in terms of philosophy and Asian philosophy, which is, you know, quite broad. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your, I mean, your absolutely stunning work. So, and it has this very much oceanic wave to it, and clearly you called it wave 2. And we have this one, wave 4. Were you thinking about environmental issues when you were creating this work?
Yes, yes. Last year I made this the new wave series. So at that time I thinking about the oceanic environment. So I made for this wave.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, with rising sea levels and, you know, clearly the oceans are being polluted with plastic. Apparently we all have microplastics within us. So this is all very, I laugh, but only because what can one do really? So it just almost seems like this insurmountable problem for any one person. So yes, I mean, it's just, and origami, I would just mention, origami, of course, is a traditional craft, and I feel like you have really elevated that to, and I, this is what I felt in particular with your work, just making it more sculptural and more fine art by using origami in this repetitive manner and increasing the scale. What do you think?
Yeah, that's true. Yes, my base. I am based on the craft artist for a long time ago, and just 10 years ago, I changed my career. into fine art. So I always the making some my artworks time spending, time consuming. Every yes. So.
It's beautiful. So that's so interesting. You were craft and then you went to fine art. So,
yes.
So what made you think that? What was the idea that, oh, I'm making craft now. Now I'm going to be making fine art. Like what changed? Was it the scale? Was it the medium? Was it the intent?
Yes, medium is not changing. So I worked on paper for over 20 years. So 3 years ago, I thinking I thought about my concept. So I originally I measured the painting and the sculpture, the traditional sculpture, casting and welding and wood. But 3 years ago, I thought about my concept and which one is best for me. So I realized that is on paper. So 30 years ago, I changed my concept into the paper. So, yeah.
That's great. I mean, paper is such a beautiful medium, and I believe you are the only paper artist in the exhibition. So thank you.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Suk-Young, I don't really know your work from before you changed to fine art. How would you characterize your work before to now? How is it different?
The difference is big differences. Yeah, people, my career is just craft called decoupage and 3D decoupage, so related to paper. But 3 years ago, I moved to USA from South Korea. So yeah, I measured the fine art. So I changed the career, big changes. Yes, yeah.
So would you say that most of your work that you did as craft was back in Korea, and now that you've come here, you're more focused on fine art?
Yeah, fine art, but material is the same, just paper.
Gotcha.
I have a question.
Yes.
So going back to, can I say something?
Yes.
We're going back to the function. What's the issue between craft and art? So we're talking about something that's not functional. For a lot of centuries, a lot of crafts, as we could say they are craft, but they're not, they're art. They didn't have any functions. At least I know a lot about textiles. In all over the cultures, historically native from Africa, from Asia, from Americas. Some of them, they're exquisite in technique, and they didn't have function. They were like gifts for kings. They were displayed in some places that they were special. And the regular people had to adapt to other kind of techniques that they were the functional objects that we use every day. That could be ceramic, wood, netting, whatever. So it was a situation historically that something that were exquisite and some they weren't, and some they were unique and some they were popular. When this changed with the craft people weren't supposed to be in guilds. Because at one time, historically, people by craft, they needed to be with the guilds, the same guild. And then there was another time where the artist decided, I'm gonna be free. And if I want to start selling what I want to do, good for whatever, and I'm gonna have a style of life that I want, and I don't have to sell, or not to sell, to be attached of the rules of the guide or the guild, or what the social and political situation according to the area geographically, because it's very difficult, very different Asia of Western culture, how through art the society had meanings or symbols that they were attached to, castles, church. So the images have a meaning, and you presented that meaning through the humanity. What do we do now? We do exactly the same through different techniques. So for instance, I have a background in painting, and textile art, in education, and history. So I know that everything is related. And when you show your art or your craft to the community, you are showing a theme. You are telling something like, okay, could be environment. Yes, you need to tell something to the public. How? You use a technique. The background that you have. If you have been an architect, maybe you are more a 3D art. In my case, I can do 3D, and sometimes I'm more flat, depending on what's the theme. If the theme is related to ecology, okay, so I'm gonna put something related with how we live now, how to support. In the case of what I'm showing is related with a social issue all over the world. We have migration of birds, migration of animals, and migration of people for different reasons. So in my case, I can do the art and craft in a theme. And according of the theme, I present the techniques that it could show more or less what the viewer can discover. Because sometimes you don't have to say a lot of things when you are showing an art piece. You can try to get the community to do their own interpretation. We are not a newspaper. We have some other skills behind us.
I like it.
And
so it's like the theme or the idea informs the media chosen.
Exactly.
Yeah. Would anybody else agree with that their media, their idea informs their the media that they're going to choose? I think Erwin, you would.
Yeah, well, I find it always very difficult because a lot of these themes sort of overlap each other. But I'm often thinking about students that come to the glass school, for instance, right? One of the projects that we do in the beginner classes is an 8x8 inch square bowl, right? And so a lot of what you think about that bowl depends on how you use it, right? It always sort of stays a bowl. And you could say it's an ashtray. That's probably sort of like the lower end of value kind of thing, right? You could also call it a sushi tray, right? And then suddenly, woof, it becomes more important, more interesting. It's no longer an ashtray, but now it's a sushi tray, right? It's the same bowl, right? It's sort of like, what do you call it? Now, you could also use it as a center in an art piece where it carries sort of molten water from an iceberg or, oil from an oil spill, right? Now, suddenly it becomes, in my mind, sort of part of the fine art world, right? It's still the same bowl. So, I have trouble sometimes. And another famous example, we had a visiting artist, a great glassblower, and he wrote on the board his definition of art versus craft. And he first drew a beautiful bird, and then he drew next to it that same bird, but dead upside down, right? So the first bird, beautiful in the tree, was craft. The second bird, dead on the ground upside down, was art. And so you can all sort of envision that, but then you have to take into account his own work, which is beautifully crafted scenes of nature. I mean, I've seen him blow a salmon, which looked like it came straight out of the river. Very few people can blow the way he does. But, and then he sets himself in the art world. He goes to fine art fairs, all that sort of stuff. So there's so much overlap there. that that intent that we talked about, I think, is definitely part of it. That how you use it, what your concept is, what your thoughts around it, what the environment is, right? So that same bowl that has been used to, hold a bit of iceberg water, right? If you get rid of the iceberg water and start using it as an ashtray again, it sort of like completes the circle. So yeah, I find it a very tricky concept.
It is, yes. And that's why my concluding sentence was, it's as elusive as ever, because I think there is this sort of elusive quality to it, to make that distinction. But I'd like to talk to a little bit about those of you who, you're clearly thinking about nature. We're going to get to everyone, I promise. I think I probably missed it. I'm going to go back. A lot of you are influenced just by nature itself. So Andrea, are you there?
Yes.
These beautiful quilted fiber and textile sculptures. Excuse me, where do you source your textiles from? I know that you're part of, you're part of Sakwa?
Yes. Yes, I'm a Saka artist.
Okay. Sakwa is an acronym for the Studio Art Quilts Association. Am I correct?
Yes.
Wonderful. So, and they will be having actually an exhibition, just to quickly mention this, at Black Rock in September called Upcycle. So it's a lot of artists who are quilting, not just fabric, but a lot of different materials that have been upcycled. So if you could just talk a little bit about your really beautiful works, just very colorful. You feel like people want to like hold them and touch them and hug them. So they have that attraction. But so where did you source your materials from?
Everywhere. It really is everywhere. I was a flat quilter, and I have a lot of quilting fabrics still on my shelves, and I do use them. And this piece itself has a lot of regular quilting fabrics, but if the texture's there, the color's there, the movement's there, I buy it. Okay. I also use a lot of designer fabric sample books, which I tear apart and use the fabrics in.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Because it's gorgeous fabric and really cool things that I could never go out and purchase myself.
Yeah.
Money becomes an option when it's $100 a yard. It's just not going to happen.
So fiber, I think like textiles is a real problem, real issue for the environment, right?
It very much can be, especially with fast fashion. A lot of the pieces go into landfills. They are not, they just cut them up and throw them away.
Okay. So I heard that they were making bricks.
Yeah.
I was reading an article.
But also
interesting.
I just want to make a quick comment on that.
Yes.
When there's actually a really beautiful tradition that we've lost with fast fashion, in that there used to be the ragman. And the ragman would come around and it would start, a piece of fabric would start with the royalty and the nobility, and it would make its way down, handed down through the hierarchy of old societal hierarchies. And then it would, once something was threadbare, it would go to the ragman, and the ragman would turn it into paper. Oh. And then it would become something that would be recycled and brought back into another life. So it was the original recycling. So that's one of the things that we've lost with fast fashion, especially when they're incorporating plastics and things like that. It becomes harder to reuse and repurpose because of these extra materials that aren't necessarily as stable for these other purposes.
I did not know that. That's so interesting. Thank you. So fabric used to be recycled into paper. That's wild. I did not know that.
Well,
Sorry.
I assume that's why good paper is called rag.
Yes.
Okay.
Of course.
A lot of handmade paper is from cotton.
Yes.
And a lot of handmade pulp comes from vegetation. It could be leaves, it could be bark, and this is historically used in different cultures around the world.
I see.
But to go back to fabric, I haven't been to India for a long time, let's say decades, but those of us who had saris that had become ragged would then send them to a quilter somewhere, and they became silk quilts or cotton quilts or something. In other words, they were repurposed. And then we got them back, and we could then feast on the memories of the layers of saris that had been that were no longer usable.
That's a beautiful tradition.
It's wonderful.
So those are called, it's spelled K-N-T-H-A, kata, and it's sort of a nasal N.
So it seems like a lot of traditional techniques and processes and sort of traditions should maybe come back. So, okay, so let's just talk. Actually, Andrea, I just want to just talk to you a little bit more. So your pieces here are on these about flowers. Do you always work in this sort of 3D way with fiber? Do you do other things besides flowers, or are you like very much focused on flowers?
Pretty much I'm focused on flowers. I work in a garden center, and at one point thought I was going to be a photographer. I have probably 1 million pictures of flowers because I just love them. And I'm getting more abstract in my flowers. Like the previous one, that's the color that the bees see when they look at a magnolia flower. Whereas this one here is a little bit more realistic.
Wonderful. So, okay, great. Unfortunately, she could not be with us today, Nolani. Margaret. By the way, I just wanted to mention Mitchell Noah is not with us today, but he also does recycled glass, which I think is quite interesting. And Sarah is not here. Patricia, we will come back to you. There we go. Margaret. So just wonderful, beautiful, whimsical works. For me, they look like as if they are inspired by nature. They are also utilitarian. And you use a lot of different materials in your work, sort of new materials, I would suggest. Polymer clay is a fairly new material, epoxy clay, I'm not sure what that is. Wire and paint, we know. These are very small, beautiful, like open pawed vessel. Are they inspired by nature?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, I look at a lot of plant forms and yeah, just primarily plant forms and to adjust the main theme, I've kind of spanned from very utilitarian work to completely non-functional artwork. And yeah, I think there's, it can be definitely a spectrum, and with my own work, I definitely kind of float back and forth on the spectrum between functional and more art-based. But I'm also, yeah, I've gone back and forth, but the influences and the materials of and the different techniques I'm using, a lot of them are very craft-based, drawing from different traditional craft mediums, which is.
But also very much fine art, I would suggest, because I mean, I think in sculpture they do a lot of like I think that what could differentiate between your work and sculpture. There's a lot of abstract sculpture, biomorphic forms based on nature, and they're considered fine art. So And I think some of your, your pieces, I like how it's for you, utilitarian is like not, it's like, yeah, sometimes I make things that can be used and sometimes I don't. And it doesn't really matter, which, I like that because that really does show that you are, kind of one of these crossover artists in the sense that it does not need to be utilitarian for me to find it interesting. It's more about the shape, the color, and yes, sometimes, selling things that have a quote unquote purpose or a more clear purpose is quite lovely. So I love that.
I went to school as an art major, and then for a while was making furniture and gone completely the other way into functional work, and now swayed back.
Yes. Well, I think there's definitely that sense of in terms of design, there's just this elusivity that I think that crosses over between everything. Cece, thank you so much, Margaret. So Cece, I want to go and see if I can find your piece right now. I'm sorry, I should have like a slide number list for this. So your works, you really have this just, totally biodegradable because your work is really crafted from nature itself. So maybe we could talk a little bit more. I'm going to go the other way. Sorry about that. There's just such a, in that particular piece in particular that you have it handcrafted, it's such a lovely work, almost spiritual, I would suggest. A lot of people felt it was quite spiritual. See if I can find it. Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, there you go. Oh,
There you go.
thank you. Sorry. So, Cece, can you maybe talk a little bit? And the way that it's displayed, we have you created an iron stand for that. So it's in a way it's changed somewhat. But so this is called Garuda, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. It'd be interesting because I know the information is there on the screen, but we'd like to hear it in your own words.
Well, thanks, Rilla, and thank you for the show. It was really an interesting room and a great, strong start for lucky us that you're here. I really enjoyed everybody's comments, in particular, I mean, the theme, not so much moving with craft versus art, but nature being a thematic in so many of your comments. I've really been enjoying all of you. So it's kind of ironic then that, yes, I use organic ephemera, a fancy way for saying plant and animal material, in a lot of hand-formed paper, by the way. In my first round of grad school, art in the book at the Corcoran was a lot of hand-formed paper, but then using wings, stones, skins, tons of plants, wood, 8-10-foot pods from trees, things like this. It's really been a very interesting practice, which I never would have guessed I would have moved to, having done many, many other things, including what you're looking at here, white casting and abstract casting over years. It's very interesting and it's very self-instructive on many fronts. But my point is, isn't it ironic, everyone, the wonderful points you've been making about nature and the beautiful depictions, whether you're using natural materials or not, of nature that I see. But I'm not really doing that. I'm using the actual materials increasingly really just to make emotional metaphors. They are so articulate. I would say at some level, this is all very abstract because we have a lot in common with them. And yes, I'm dealing with a lot of the wisdom in nature in terms of accepting impermanence, but a lot of regeneration and adaptation as that goes along. Utility when things begin to decompose or when they're dead. Honor, they were dead. They wanted to survive. Many of my materials, these are things that were living. They are no longer. You know that when you're putting your hands on there, and there's a good deal of honor. But there is this wonderful expanded sense of beauty. And of course, they creep a lot of people out too. Again, less this piece. This piece with Garuda, there are actually 4 or 5 different abstracted body parts with this really quite elegant mathematical wing. Wings are, but this is a larger wing. And it does make a point. And thank you for sensing a little bit of something, well, it sounds a little precious to say sacred, but something somewhat sacred in it. And it can be interpreted in many ways. But a lot of the other materials, they provoke, they evoke. But everybody doesn't just go, wow, that's great. I'm not making necessarily a beautiful flower out of flower materials or a beautiful depiction, I'll just say, of nature, but they can evoke in you a feeling of struggle, of survival, of resilience, of course, sadness and happiness and everything else. So it's really been an instructive set of materials. Garuda is a story in Eastern spiritual scholarship. This is a mythical bird. In fact, Kanika, maybe some others know a bit more about this, but the version I have heard over many years is that the Garuda is a bird that hatches fully grown. You know, a phoenix comes up out of the, well, it's sort of similar to that, but this one, it hatches fully grown, has its feathers, and can immediately soar. And it's a metaphor for the belief in many philosophies that we actually have our true nature that is entirely complete. And it is something shared with whatever the larger sense in life, something divine, or however you would say it, is there. And the problem is in our world, in our eras, in our sufferings and violence and all kinds of troubles from small to large, that we have obscured this nature that the Garuda just immediately knows and has and takes with it. So anyway, to me, the clinical creepiness of white being a color of death in some cultures, but to me, and I think more in the West, something very purifying. And then an abstracted human form with the wing says, at its most basic point, we have a lot in common. Life and death, you know, flight as hope and imagination. And then you can stop and go from there, and viewers make of it what they will, or sometimes they don't know. I think everybody here would agree with your materials and this beautiful work that everybody's made. A lot of times people don't know what to make of your work, and that's the best, because it's a portal and off they go. So I'm really enjoying everybody's comments. So.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's such a fascinating backstory, and you're right. Like the white and the black could be flipped in different cultures, so it's very interesting. And you're like doing found objects, but you're finding your objects within nature. So that's wonderful. Lisa, I want to talk. I'm sorry, I'm going to do my game again where I just like, where
I'm all the way back at the beginning.
Okay, there you go. So very fluid forms. And I think that, so again, your work is inspired by nature as well, erosion. And again, ceramics is, really comes from, like, traditional clay comes from, the earth. And so this is really interesting. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your process. What is it called? A noborigami kiln?
Yes, a noborigami kiln. Yes. So this is part of my work that really, is part of a longer tradition of craft, which, I'm very much influenced by a lot of potters that I've worked with over the years. And the noborigami itself is a wonderful type of kiln from the Japanese culture and from China as well. I mean, they're multi-chambered kilns. They're these really large brick structures that you can stand inside of. And there's each chamber is large enough for a couple of people to stand in, and you fill them with pots that need to be fired, and pots and sculptures and whatever else people are making. And so this is a community process as well, because it takes a lot of people to do this. It's a really large, it's a large undertaking. There's usually 10 or 12 maybe people involved in a firing like that. And so it's one of the things about it that is fascinating. There's many things about it that are fascinating. I love the community aspect of it, but I also feel like just all of the movement of the flame through the kiln is such a powerful thing, and it's transformative. And so I think about the powers of transformation and the forces of fire and wind and water and those things that are, the primal elements in our world, but also they're the fundamental building blocks of the work that I make. And so I feel like I'm inspired by the things that are also the materials that I work with.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. That's so beautifully said. Thank you. So
I did also have a quick story about art and craft. Just from a number of years ago, I was intrigued by the idea of trying to take some of my ceramic works and turn them into bronze sculptures. And so, and of course, bronze is a very traditional high art form. And I went to Philadelphia for a series of classes at the Academy of Fine Arts up there, and I learned the bronze casting process and, you know, making all of those molds and being there for the bronze pour. And it's a wonderful process. And then, you know, kind of somehow through doing that, I realized that I don't want to do that for my work because when you do that, you're essentially, the artist is coming up with the original concept and then handing it off to other people who are going to perform the craft of creating all of those, you know, those steps, those handmade things, and applying the patinas and doing the welding and, you know, all those things that you have to do. And I realized that I want to be involved in every step of the making of my art. And so to me, that kind of taught me that the art was the original idea, and then the craft was the execution and sort of the
I like that. I love
techniques. Yeah.
So foundries exist right all over the country. They are happy to take your work, I believe, and, you know, translate it into various metals. I believe that that there have been the artists who have done the actual transformation themselves. But I love your idea of saying, like, I really just want to have, you know, a hands-on process, which for handcrafted is very suitable. So does anybody here feel really powerfully, also, I would presume most everyone, very powerfully, that you have to be involved in the process of creation, that unlike Jeff Koons or other artists, that passing that off, or, you know, giving that process to somebody else, like an artist assistant or so forth, which is, I'm sorry to Jeff Koons, I don't mean to, you know, single him out, because clearly a lot of artists do that. But do you feel very powerfully, I would just have a show of hands, that you want to be involved in that process, and that process is extremely important? So does anybody not really care? Like, I could pass this off. If I had an artist assistant, I'd be okay with that.
Well, I'd like an assistant, just an assistant, to do things like wedging the clay.
Okay. Get the bubbles out of the clay.
Carrying those heavy bags of clay.
I mean, as we all do.
Clean up after when I'm done. Okay, I see. Okay.
I certainly, just rule, I mean, I certainly agree with what Lisa's saying, and we all want to be very much involved in our concept, in our design, in the materials, etc. But I just want to put a small, but there are times that I've had, and I think I will in the future, where it just depends on the particular thing or installation or armature that you're talking about and the scale of it, but you can have a terrific relationship with a fabricator. And it's your design, and you're there, and you can also apprentice all the way through. So I agree with Lisa, but then I'm whispering, but of course there is a real role, and some really beautiful fabricators, if they will work with you and listen to you, it's not a handoff. But I know what she meant about the bronze process, but just a small note.
Yes. So there is not just an environmental or nature theme in this exhibit. A lot of you guys really happened to focus on that. But we had a lot of other themes as well, although nature was certainly, and sustainability and climate change is a major one. So I just want to talk to Patricia as well as Phyllis. So we're going to go to, let's see where your thing is. All right, so let's see here. And you guys, you were not the odd man out. And Alan, we're gonna get to you as well. Actually, if you don't mind, before we move forward, let's talk about Alan, because that actually really relates quite well. So because of your intersection of craft painting and sculpture, and you're using clay and repurposed fabric, and that was actually quite true for Helen Blumen's work. There Are No Words. She's using recycled fabric as well. So maybe we can talk about your work as well, and notions of beauty and so forth. So Alan, your work just has, for me in particular, it captured my attention, just that sense of using very unusual materials combined together, as well as that sort of contrast of fabric and the color, and then the contrast of these sort of monochromatic textures. And it's just very intriguing to me. So.
Yeah, well, I think there's a confluence of influences that are there in the work. And yeah, I have been very interested in nature and the kind of crusty surfaces you might find on things like lichen or rock formations. But I'm also interested in textures that you might find in urban environments, on weathered buildings and telephone poles where a lot of signs have been posted up, and the little bits of fabric and or paper that might remain on there. Yeah. I don't know that there's like a linear way that I think about the work. I had worked representationally for a major portion of my career, and then headed off into other directions a little over a decade ago. So I'm trying to, I think, approach this in a pretty open-ended way and have an adventure in the studio where, I'm taking myself to some place that I hadn't quite envisioned just a short while before. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is to work with alternatives to traditional materials. I worked and taught ceramics for decades. And I then started using this resin clay or an epoxy clay, I think someone else referred to it as.
Yeah.
It doesn't require firing. It's a very different kind of material. And, I wanted to see if I could emulate some of the clay surfaces and textures that I've been working with in ceramic. And then I started to think about, an alternative to a painted surface, and developed a sort of a fabric mache process where I can build with little bits of fabric and come up with what I think of as an equivalent to painting without using paint. And the one thing for me that it sort of started off in a very experimental way with some fabric pieces that I had, sewing scraps from projects that my family had been involved with. And most importantly, though, I had a big collection of neckties that were my father's, and I just didn't want to give away like I had with a lot of his clothing. And I thought, okay, well, there's some interesting patterns there. There's like 50 years worth of neckties there in his closet. And so I started using little bits of that fabric and cutting them up and trying to put it into the work. And it really, I found to be very resonant. And then both in terms of the memories and associations I had with the fabric, but also I got really interested in the possibilities of like layering on these different patterns and colors. And I've broadened that out and looked for lots of other materials I've sourced from all over the place. But
yeah, so there's an autobiographical component to it.
It's buried in there, yes.
Great. So
there's little bits of those family fabrics in pretty much every piece.
Yeah, that kind of relates to what Kanika, you were saying about how saris are then cut up and made into quilts as well. So that, I think it relates a little bit to that. So very interesting. I mean, and you have, though, very much a distinct style. I mean, anywhere where I go, Alan, I'm going to know your work. So, and that, I guess, it really develops. When was this style a fairly recent style, or how many years have you been working in this sort of distinctive
This direction's a little bit more than a decade, I would say. I worked with representational ceramics for almost 30 years. So, I mean, it was, that was really the bulk of my career. And when I moved away from working in fired materials, actually, I won't say totally moved away from fired materials, because I worked with glass for a little period of time and worked with a glass caster and did some cast figurative work. But then the glass casting process was really cumbersome and difficult to actualize here in Richmond. And I started looking for some other materials, and I knew of this this epoxy that handled like clay, and I wanted to work with that. And I started experimenting with that. And what I really started with were some wire sculptures that I would then coat with this epoxy clay. And so it was like a clay line in space, a three-dimensional line. That was really interesting to me. And it slowly evolved to be work that is kind of what is in the show here. But the fabric has been maybe 5 years or so of working, bringing that into the work.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just really very distinctive. So just because that is, we have a little bit of autobiography there, we can make a nice transition over to Phyllis May's work. And so Phyllis, I mean, you have two pieces. You have the assemblage work that was included, and then we also have this embroidery piece, which I believe it was embroidery on found linen, like an old antique linen. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was actually given to me by someone. I'm convinced that one of the best deals these days are these hand embroidered linens that nobody uses anymore. And all of the area around the outside that you see on this piece was I didn't do. It's cross stitch and it's done by hand by someone. And then I just took that and superimposed the cartoon character and the circles onto it in an attempt to make it match. And so, oh my God, so many, first of all, I'm so happy and honored to be with this group of artists. I feel like it was such a great show. And I enjoyed meeting so many of you at the opening. My work, I think, isn't really about nature at all. It's more about culture, and specifically emotions or childhood emotions, probably, at least I think so. I'm not sure that what I think my work is about is what my work is about, but that's another story.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I chose your work, in particular, this particular work, for me as the curator thinking about it, I felt that in this particular work, that the craft, if you will, as I defined it as manipulation, skilled manipulation of media, was in fact paint. So, because it's this, very skilled sense of, manipulation of paint. And for me, and I didn't want to include a bunch of paintings. So I wanted to get away from that sort of emphasis. But I liked the way that you had this paint and on there, and that, that this is, a self-portrait as well. And the reference, to self-portrait in point shoes. And then this particular character as well is just such a fun, colorful character. I don't actually even know, who is Ma?
Well, Ma is a wide open mouth, but I've always intended to use it as a tag when I start my graffiti life, which is on my bucket list. To me, it stands for middle-aged woman too.
Okay, okay, there we go. That's what I thought, is there has some nice philosophy around feminism and being a woman, and you know, growing up as a girl and so forth. So
well, I don't, you know, for this piece, I think it's, for me, it's like I want to bring up an article that I read 10 years ago, maybe no less than that, but you know, Greenberg's The Avant-Garde and Kitsch, which set up these intense rules for, I mean, it's a good article. I would recommend it. It's well written and well argued, but I just hated everything about it. It just infuriated me. Okay. You know, making these really rigid rules about what counts as fine art. Okay. But even before then, I was starting to rebel against that. And so I love playing with the idea of kitsch and thinking, well, how is this different than, you know, and I also love, maybe this is my imagination or what I like to think, but I feel like I see sometimes confusion when people see these things like, well, is this like an embroidery kit you got, you know? Okay. And I like, this is kind of meant to be a version of the Disney character Stitch that I'm obsessed with. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of Stitch, not quite, but I see. You know, I really, really love Stitch, and I love certain images that are doll and troll like, and which I paint all the time, that have to do with, you know, I mean, I guess it has to have to do with my childhood. Yeah. And ideas about cute that that still just, you know, that I still love. Yeah.
I love your manifesto. I just love it because it's just, oh, I have a manifesto, you know, I've written one, because that, it reminds me of like something that I would have done too, you know, like back, you know, and I just, it's such a like, wow, somebody has a manifesto. It's such a an enormous thing to say. I think
it's so silly. I meant it as a kind of joke, because I'm in this, I was in this group and we were reading a lot of art history and theory. And when we got to the futurists, some of you may remember reading Martinelli's manifesto of futurism, and it's just so outrageous. You know, it's very anti-woman and pro-war. It's, you know, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna, you know, respond to this. And it started as a joke, but then it became kind of serious. It really, I think, is my manifesto.
Yeah, I actually quite agree with a lot you should put in there. So very nice. So just to move on due to time, so Patricia, this particular piece, I know that you work in feminist themes as well. This in particular uses glass and enamel, and I guess stepping off, is that a feminist work? For me, I interpreted it as such, like I'm going to step off, not just the pavement, but I'm going to step off and, you know, do something brave with my life or so forth. Where did this work come from in terms of your theme?
Yes, it was, well, first of all, I came to glass later. I have background, a fine arts background, but I started working with glass a few years ago. And the point of this was actually, it's based on a self-portrait and using the idea of the shoes and the feet as a portrait of someone. And that it is about, as a woman, stepping off the sidewalk into the unknown and onto something, as you're saying, a new adventure. And the whole point of the green stockings or the green colored legs having to do with growth. And the flowers having to do with being part of nature and life. And so that's why I did those images or painted that onto the image.
Excellent. I love that. So yeah, because the pavement is sort of like the safe space, right?
Yeah, she's
Don't
stepping
want to
off
go walking. We're not promoting walking in the street here, but
no, she's stepping off the pavement onto that lit area or that lighter area, and it's unknown, and it's sort of, you really don't know what's there.
yeah, beautiful. So just due to time, I think we're gonna close there. I just wanted to thank you all so much for coming today and just participating in this very casual conversation, which is very nice, very enjoyable. I will be placing this on YouTube for anyone who wanted to come and see this and unfortunately was not able to. And if we have any final words from anyone, please feel free to state them now. It's just been
Thank you so much.
wonderful. So
Rula,
you.
this is Katie from BlackRock. I'm finally made it to BlackRock. I just want to thank all of you. Today was absolutely spectacular.
thank you all.
Come
so
see
much.
us again. Come see us again
Thank
before
you.
it closes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Rula. Thank you,
Right.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Rula.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.